This is AMTV. Hello there everyone, and welcome to part 29 of this series looking at the history and impact of Doctor Who viewing figures. If you're joining us for the first time, a very warm welcome to you. We hope you stick around for future instalments and check out our previous episodes. We've covered the entire run of the classic series, including the TV movie. But for now, sit back, relax, and join me once again as we delve back into the wonderfully niche world of Doctor Who viewing figures. Our destination? The second part of the Wilderness Years. The year is 1997, and after nearly a year since the TV movie, Doctor Who fans eagerly awaited news on their hero's further return to the small screen. Whilst the episode was a success here in the UK, the situation had been entirely different overseas. The 8.3 million American viewers who tuned in only made up around 9% of the audience, far from the 15% that Fox were after. Despite discussions taking place, it was ultimately decided that Doctor Who would not be renewed for a fresh season of New Adventures, and instead, the TV movie would essentially become a pilot for a show that wouldn't exist. In the UK, given the ratings success of Paul McGann's debut, you could perhaps forgive fans for thinking that this was finally it, that their beloved show would finally be making the triumphant return to television that it so rightly deserved. But by 1997, most of that renewed hope began to fade away once again, with fans realising that the Wilderness Years were once again looming over the Time Lord. But just like in the first half of the 1990s, Doctor Who wouldn't vanish entirely. It survived cancellation once before. Why should this be any different? The VHS range of classic releases returned in January to pick up where they had left off. Those who were disappointed at the meagre 3 releases in 1996 would have been pleased that this number had been bumped to 5. This is still a far cry from a few years previous, but the range was back up and running, and that's what mattered the most. God forbid if Doctor Who fans should have an incomplete collection. The 5 releases on VHS this year were The Leisure Hive, a double set of The Awakening and Frontios, The War Machines, The Happiness Patrol, and the E-Space Trilogy box set, comprising of Full Circle, State of Decay, and Warrior's Gate. The format and look of the tapes had changed once more, dropping the diamond logo that had been in use for well over a decade, adapting the one seen in the TV movie instead. There was also a change in style for the VHS range, with painted covers being dropped in favour of a photo montage design, which would continue for the remainder of the range's life. Well, what about the books? For much of the 1990s, the Virgin New Adventures, as well as the Missing Adventures, held up the flag for original Doctor Who content, continuing the story where the TV show had left off. While for the first part of 1997, the trend of one new release a month continued, with titles such as Eternity Weeps, The Room with No Doors, and the renowned or infamous title Lungbarrow, which is quite the read if you can get your hands on it. April's release would prove to be the last VNA, which was titled The Dying Days, and has the distinction of being the only book in the range to feature Paul McGann's 8th Doctor, instead of Sylvester McCoy's 7th. May 1997 saw the release of So Vile a Sin, a book that should have been published back in 1996, but The Dying Days technically, and numerically, is the last of the experimental VNAs. The incumbent Doctor's adventures would continue, but not with Virgin. With their license now expired, the BBC decided that any new original Doctor Who content in the printed medium would be handled by their own publishing imprint, BBC Books. Without missing a beat, the new line of 8th Doctor adventures began in June 1997 with The 8 Doctors, penned by series legend Terrance Dicks. BBC Books would follow Virgin's example of one new release a month, 1997 giving us The 8 Doctors, Vampire Science, The Body Snatchers, Genocide, War of the Daleks, and Alien Bodies. As mentioned, The Missing Adventures, which had begun in 1994, continued also. Under Virgin's license, the 1997 releases were Burning Heart, A Device of Death, The Dark Path, and The Well-Mannered War. BBC Books decided to continue this range as well, with their 1997 releases being The Devil Goblins from Neptune, The Murder Game, The Ultimate Treasure, Business Unusual, Illegal Alien, and The Roundheads. So even when there was no new Who on telly, fans still had plenty to choose from when it came to new adventures. You could even decide to embark on a new adventure with the Doctor in the digital world. 1997 saw the release of the PC game Destiny of the Doctors, which has gone on to quite some infamy for one reason or another. Whilst exceedingly primitive by today's standards, I'm sure this was, well, quite something back in the day. The highlights are arguably the live action segments, featuring none other than the Master, played ever faithfully by Anthony Ainley. These scenes are brand new and campy as they are, they show just how deliciously Ainley took on the role as the renegade arch-rival to the Doctor. And sadly, Destiny of the Doctors would mark the final time that Anthony would play the role of the Master, before his death some years later, in 2004. And yet, despite no new series being commissioned, Doctor Who's 30 Years of Adventures was still being shown on television, courtesy of UK Gold. We've touched on this channel before, commenting how from 1992 all the way up until 2007, it regularly repeated Doctor Who, from as early as An Unearthly Child, all the way up until the TV movie itself. 1997 saw the programme bounce around UK Gold schedules, appearing sometimes on weekdays, but mainly settling on a Sunday morning slot for most of the omnibus repeats. Unfortunately, I can't find reliable data regarding the viewing figures for these stories, but we can assume that considering they'd been in fairly consistent rotation since 1992, that a decent amount of viewership was being built up. But even though the Doctor's adventures were available to view on UK Gold, or via VHS or off-air recordings people took at the time, it couldn't match the feeling of anticipating a brand new set of episodes on a Saturday night. Having been stringed along during the first half of the 90s before the TV movie came about, fans were probably a bit more prepared this time for a potentially long wait. Though this time, there was even more uncertainty and doubt as to whether the programme would ever return as a regularly produced TV show. The year is 1998, which in turn would mark Doctor Who's 35th anniversary. Now, looking at the history of the programme, you'd know that for most anniversaries, something special is always produced. The 3 Doctors marked 10 years, the 5 Doctors commemorated 20, Dimensions in Time may not have been the 30th anniversary special people had expected, or maybe even wanted, but it was something to enjoy nonetheless. So what treats could we expect to mark 35 years? Well, for the most part, nothing. There were no repeats on BBC One, or even BBC Two, no special programmes or documentaries. You'd be forgiven for thinking that the Beeb had completely passed the milestone by. That is unless you had access to BBC Choice, which was the corporation's first truly digital channel. The service launched in September 1998, and just a couple of months later, dedicated several nights to celebrating Doctor Who's 35th anniversary. Between the 22nd and 27th of November, an episode representing each of the 8 Doctors, including Genesis of the Daleks in its entirety, again, and the 30 Years in the TARDIS documentary, well, it turned out to be quite the Who-filled week for fans who had access. Aside from Genesis, representing the 4th Doctor, the other stories to feature across the week were An Unearthly Child, the pilot version of Part 1, and then the final parts of Tomb of the Cybermen, The Demons, The Caves of Androzani, The Trial of a Time Lord, and The Curse of Fenric. Individual episodes may be an odd way to dip in, but it was something at least, and to top it off, special links were filmed with the 7th Doctor himself, Sylvester McCoy. Not only was it great to see him again, but he was placed within a brand new TARDIS control room, one that presented a rather interesting levitating console design. If only we had gotten to see it in the show proper. Like with UK Gold, reliable data regarding the viewing figures on BBC Choice is scarce, but we know the digital channel had far less reach than the terrestrial and established BBC's 1 and 2, especially in its inaugural year. There would be sporadic Doctor Who repeats on BBC Choice over the next few years, up until the service closed down in 2003, to be replaced by BBC 3, which would go on to be a key player in the world of Doctor Who some years later, but we aren't quite there yet. When it came to home media, the long-standing VHS range continued to bulk back up after the hiatus in 1996. 5 releases made their way onto store shelves in 1997, and this number would rise to 7 for 1998. The classic stories released onto VHS were Timelash, Battlefield, The Mind of Evil, albeit in black and white, Horror of Fang Rock, Planet of Fire, The Ark, and a special box set of The Ice Warriors, which contained the then sole surviving episode of The Underwater Menace, as well as a new documentary, The Missing Years, which was dedicated to the programme's lost episodes. Whilst the amount of releases weren't as plentiful as in the first half of the 90s, there would be some good reason for this. The amount of available releases that BBC Video could draw from was beginning to dwindle, so plans would have to be made to either eke out the range for as long as possible, or to perhaps embrace an entirely new format, one that was beginning to rise in popularity, maybe even spelling the end of the old faithful videotape. But of course, more on that when we get there. New adventures with the 8th Doctor continued under BBC Books, with one new release every month throughout 1998. These releases were Kursal, Option Lock, Longest Day, Legacy of the Daleks, Dreamstone Moon, Seeing Eye, Placebo Effect, Vander Deacon's Children, The Scarlet Empress, The Janus Conjunction, and Bell Tempest. If you wanted to check in with any of the first 7 Doctors in print, BBC Books offered the following past adventures: The Face of the Enemy, Eye of Heaven, The Witch Hunters, The Hollow Men, Catastrophia, Mission Impractical, Zeta Major, Dreams of Empire, Last Man Running, Matrix, and The Infinity Doctors. It's nice to see that even in the franchise's 35th anniversary year, despite no major special events on television, the Doctor still was very much having brand new adventures we could enjoy, whether in print or via the ever-continuing comic strip in Doctor Who magazine, which had been featuring the 8th Doctor front and centre since late 1996. DWM also celebrated the 35th anniversary, as you'd expect, but overall, when looking back, this was probably one of the quietest milestone years for Doctor Who. It's understandable to some extent, with it looking unlikely that the show would ever return as a TV series. The BBC didn't have the biggest drive or incentive to make a thing of it. The fact they dedicated a week of repeats on their digital channel is at the very least something, but the vast majority of Brits wouldn't have had access to the service, never mind whether they'd be interested in tuning in or not. UK Gold ran repeats all throughout 1998, with even the black and white era getting a look in for the first time in many years, as well as the TV movie making its debut on the channel in February. But even they didn't do any special sort of evening or event to mark the programme's 35th birthday. Small celebrations aside, Doctor Who's legacy continued on, with the new millennium fast approaching. The year is 1999, and whilst the 35th anniversary year may have been a quiet one overall, this year would prove to be a very different story indeed. Alongside the usual releases of the new VHS tapes or books, there would be a brand new format for fans to sink their teeth into, and even a brand new televised adventure, but not perhaps in the traditional sense you may be expecting. The spring would herald the comic relief event hosted by the BBC, and with it, Doctor Who would make a grand return, with several new actors playing the iconic Time Lord. The Doctor Who comic relief special is The Curse of Fatal Death. The Doctor informs the Master that he intends to give up his travels to marry his companion, Emma. On the planet Tercerus, the Doctor and the Master compete to outwit each other, but the Doctor is finally outmaneuvered and is taken prisoner by the Daleks. This story was originally broadcast as 4 mini-episodes, ranging from 5 to 7 minutes in length, on Friday the 12th of March 1999, as part of that year's comic relief. Here are the viewing figures for this adventure, and we can see that these numbers are decently high, Doctor Who having not reached this level in its regular run for years before it had been cancelled. The first mini-episode was the strongest, sitting just under 10 million, with not a vast drop-off for the second instalment. The third suffered the biggest drop, more than 3.5 million viewers dipping, before many of them returned for the final part. It's certainly an intriguing set of viewing figures considering all 4 went out on the same evening, not too far from each other time-wise. So why were they not more consistent across the board? Well, one important factor is to take into account the structure of the comic relief telethon itself. Spread out across the entire evening, Doctor Who, whilst being one of the main events of the night, had to share the stage with several other specially shot segments, celebrity guests, and so on. Perhaps to echo the original series style of multiple episodes, the story was split into 4, the first airing at around 8:10 and the last beginning towards 10:10. Highs and lows throughout comic relief, or indeed any charity telethon, are quite common and are to be expected to some extent, but why were Part 3's figures so drastically lower compared to the others? Well, you see, even though it does go on for several hours, comic relief does have to dip out for the news, and at 9 PM, it did exactly that. Many switch over to different channels during the news, and likely forgot or just didn't tune back into BBC One once the bulletin had concluded, arguably causing this vast drop for Part 3. However, it's reassuring to see that the vast majority of those viewers did tune back into the Beeb, with Part 4 recovering almost all of the audience that it had lost. But as we know, it's not just scheduling within the BBC that matters, but also what's on the other side. What was its competition? Considering by 1999 there were hundreds of channels available, we're going to focus mainly on the BBC's long-standing rival, that being ITV. The other side had scheduled a DIY show, with Carol Vorderman, against the Doctor's opening episode, and although Carol brought in over 9 million viewers, she was just ever so slightly eclipsed by The Curse of Fatal Death. However, once Who Wants to Be a Millionaire came on at 9 PM, it comfortably blew Doctor Who out of the water, bringing in an impressive 14.5 million viewers, staggering numbers for a quiz show. I'd hazard a guess that's what the millions who left BBC One just before the news were switching over to, and though Millionaire is a brilliant show, it would have been nice if the Doctor's long-awaited return had been able to push into double figures. Promotion is another factor we must look into. Being tied with Comic Relief, and one of the headliners in fact, The Curse of Fatal Death received a healthy bout of promotion. Doctor Who magazine gave it a front cover spot, and the Radio Times, the leading television listings magazine, gave it a good deal of coverage weeks before broadcast. The main appeal was arguably that Rowan Atkinson, of Mr. Beam fame, would be taking the controls of the TARDIS as the Ninth Doctor. Yes, you read that correctly. Atkinson wasn't the only big name to be tied with the special either, as Jonathan Pryce, who hadn't long starred as a villain in the James Bond film Tomorrow Never Dies, would be taking on the role of the Master. Julia Sawala would play Emma, the Doctor's companion, and later fiancée. Don't worry, we'll get to that. And there were a few twists and turns that viewers could expect throughout the adventure. The Curse of Fatal Death is a beautiful oddity in the Doctor Who universe. It's very clearly a parody, with wobbly sets, all the tropes and clichés that the programme would get lambasted for, and yet, there's a part of it that treats itself completely seriously, regardless of cheap production or iffy dialogue. Speaking of the dialogue, you may be interested to know that this adventure was written by a writer known as Stephen Moffat. I wonder if we'll ever hear from him again in the future. He clearly knows his Doctor Who, as all the tropes that are picked on feel deliciously right for the programme, and the references are clearly from a fan who knows their stuff. In terms of performances, Rowan Atkinson is memorable right from the off, delivering that British eccentricity he's so well known for, and would arguably make a cracking Doctor. Jonathan Pryce is clearly relishing the chance to play the Master, and even in the more silly moments, like the aging hundreds of years after falling into a sewer, or wearing the etheric beam locators, he's not shying away from making it as hilarious as possible. But remember how I mentioned about twists and turns in the story? Well, in the latter half, the Ninth Doctor is duly exterminated, regenerating into his 10th incarnation, played by Richard E. Grant. This Doctor is confident, sexy, and lick the mirror handsome? Whatever that means. But after some sexual innuendos, this Doctor is struck down too, with Jim Broadbent emerging as the 11th Doctor. He's completely shy around women, jeopardising his and Emma's future marriage, but he too falls to bad wiring, becoming a rather dashing Hugh Grant. When all seems sorted out, a blast of energy hits him, destroying his ability to regenerate. And even though this is a comedy, we get one of my absolute favourite lines.
He was never cruel and never cowardly, and it'll never be safe to be scared again.
But wait, there's more. The Doctor in fact does regenerate, this time into a woman, Joanna Lumley to be precise, the 13th Doctor. A blonde woman as the 13th Doctor. Sounds familiar somehow. Overall, this story attracted an average of 8.4 million viewers. This is more than 500,000 lower than what the TV movie achieved back in 1996, and of course a few million lower than the masterpiece that is Dimensions in Time, but when compared to Doctor Who's original 26-year run on BBC One, this is the best average an adventure had achieved since Time Flight brought season 19 to a close in 1982, with just under 9 million viewers tuning in. Not bad at all for a comedy special. At its heart, The Curse of Fatal Death is a lot of fun. It's a celebration of Doctor Who, but also isn't afraid to poke fun at it. Its tongue is firmly in cheek, and it's also very, very funny. It's not the Doctor Who you may be used to, but it's a hilarious sidestep that deserves the praise it gets. If you'd like to check it out, it's freely available to watch on YouTube, from the official Comic Relief channel. However, if you'd like to own it on home media, there's really only one option available to you, and that's on good old VHS, this tape releasing a few months after broadcast in 1999. It contains not only The Curse of Fatal Death, but other gems that link Doctor Who and Comic Relief in some way, and it's a fun little item to have in your collection. As of 2024, it's never been released on DVD, but you never know, maybe it'll appear in one of the Blu-ray collection sets one day. But if you've never seen it before, or wish to show people who haven't, get ready for a mini adventure full of laughs, gags, and many, many Doctors.
Tell me, why do they call you the Master?
I'll explain later.
Just as fans have become accustomed to throughout the 1990s, the final decade of the year wouldn't disappoint when it came to home media, with 8 releases on VHS becoming available for purchase. These titles were Nightmare of Eden, The Keys of Marinus, yet another re-release of Revenge of the Cybermen, this one in episodic form, The Face of Evil, a box set featuring the Space Museum, and the 2 surviving episodes of The Crusade, Terror of the Zygons, a re-release presented in episodic form, a beautifully produced Dalek tin, featuring Revelation of the Daleks and Planet of the Daleks, the latter mostly being presented in colour, with episode 3 being in black and white. But perhaps the most anticipated release of 1999 for Doctor Who fans was The Curse of Fatal Death. This would have been a welcome surprise, as sometimes charity specials for one reason or another cannot be released on home video. But whilst the VHS range continued, Doctor Who would embrace another format in 1999, a newer digital format, one that boasted incredible capabilities, all stored onto a CD-sized disc. This, of course, was the DVD. Having first been introduced in 1996, DVD, like most new video formats, took some time to catch on with the public. Its capabilities were certainly impressive, with the quality it offered blowing anything VHS could achieve out of the water. So with fewer past adventures to release on VHS, it makes sense that BBC Video decided that they could issue out the Doctor's adventures all over again on the digital versatile disc. And so they would, as in November 1999, the 20th anniversary special, The Five Doctors, would become the first story to be released onto DVD. It boasted a flashy 3D menu based around the TARDIS console, included the 1995 special edition of the story that released to VHS some years prior, and even contained special features, one of the standout new abilities offered by DVD. By today's standard, this release is, well, far from perfect, but the team putting out the DVDs would begin to refine and perfect the look, feel, and functionality of the Doctor Who range once the new millennium came around. The 8th Doctor may have only had one title to release on VHS, but his catalogue of adventures was growing quickly when it came to original books. The releases that dropped in 1999 were The Face Eater, The Taint, Demontage, Revolution Man, Dominion, Unnatural History, Autumn Mist, Interference Books 1 and 2, The Blue Angel, The Taking of Planet 5, and Frontier Worlds. The Past Adventures range was also expanding quickly, with its 1998 releases being Salvation, The Wages of Sin, Deep Blue, Players, Millennium Shock, Storm Harvest, The Final Sanction, City at World's End, Divided Loyalties, and Corpse Marker. Original Doctor Who adventures were still going strong for all 8 incarnations, but further trips in the TARDIS were about to occur in another realm altogether. Big Finish Productions had been operating since 1996, and from 1998 had been producing their own original audio drama adventures, featuring Bernice Summerfield as the central character. Benny had been created for the Virgin New Adventures range back in the early 90s, and had become so popular that she seemed like a natural choice to lead the range, especially when Big Finish was still negotiating with the BBC about acquiring the official Doctor Who license. Well, in 1999, they got that license, and in the summer, The Sirens of Time would become the first original Doctor Who audio drama to be produced by Big Finish. Together with Phantasmagoria and Whispers of Terror, these 3 1999 releases would kickstart a range of monthly stories that would last for more than 2 decades, and opening up a whole world of adventures for not just the Doctor, but for any character within the Whoniverse. As the show's birthday approached in November, a rather special evening was trailered to be taking place on BBC Two. On Saturday, the 13th of November, from 8:55pm until midnight, BBC Two was completely dedicated to Doctor Who, with a Dalek-themed ident to boot. The night was chock full of goods, including an introduction presented by Tom Baker, comedy skits featuring actors such as Mark Gatiss and David Walliams, documentaries on the history of the show, and some of the famous monsters that had appeared, and of course, screenings of classic episodes. The final episode of the first Dalek serial was chosen as one of them, with it attracting around 1.6 million viewers. It's rather a low figure for 1999 standards, but it went out past 10pm and really would have only been appealing to the core Doctor Who fan demographic. The story had been available on home video for a decade and had been repeated on UK Gold on a number of occasions. Even though it didn't crack BBC Two's top 30 programmes for the week, certain elements of Doctor Who Night did. The Carnival of Monsters documentary, with an audience of 2.37 million, finished 24th, and the Adventures in Time and Space one that preceded it placed at 22nd, with an audience of 2.47 million. The night closed off with a screening of the uncut version of the TV movie, which had some parts originally censored here in the UK. This repeat broadcast attracted 1.4 million viewers, which is lower than the 60s Dalek episode, but keep in mind the TV movie began just after 11pm, and with the story readily available on home video, there may have been less incentive to watch. In terms of competition, one of the biggest that Doctor Who Night faced was Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, then in its infancy, and was pulling well over 10 million viewers with nearly every episode. Following it was an audience with Cliff Richard, the pop star also pulling in more than 10 million viewers. So it's fair to say that the Doctor, the Daleks, and all of the new material faced some pretty stiff competition. But regardless, Doctor Who Night was a pilot of sorts, at least when it came to the programme on BBC Two. Behind the scenes, restoration efforts were being carried out on some of the early colour stories from the Jon Pertwee era, and just a few days after Doctor Who Night, the first of these serials would be cleaned up and would debut on BBC Two, kickstarting what was envisaged to be a lengthy tenure on the established channel. The repeat season kicked off with Spearhead from Space, the first Jon Pertwee story, and the first colour adventure to boot. Here are the viewing figures for this repeat, which averaged out at 2.61 million viewers. Granted, none of the 4 episodes are able to surpass the 3 million mark, and after episodes 1 and 2, shown on the same night as a double bill, the numbers gradually fall throughout the rest of the story. Even with all of the added choice in television available in 1999, surfing below 3 million viewers was not necessarily the best result or the best look. One small saving grace, however, is that all 4 episodes made BBC Two's top 30 programmes for their respective weeks. Episodes 1 and 2 both finished at 19th, Episode 3 lowered down at 26th, and Episode 4 almost dropping out completely at 29th. Primarily going out at 6 PM, therefore against many news programmes, the repeat's chances may have always had a thorn in their side. And whilst it's unclear what the BBC were expecting or hoping viewing figure-wise, this grand start to what was set to be a lengthy marathon of Doctor Who was not the popular beginning that they needed. The repeats continued with Doctor Who and the Silurians, the next story chronologically, and the first colour 7-parter. Now, unfortunately, the viewing figures data for this particular repeat is unavailable, but based on what came just before and what was to come, we can only assume that the numbers perhaps began at a similar level before dropping. A 7-part story that's already 30 years old, 1 episode a week, that's a big commitment. And considering the vast amount of choice the British public now had, even though the repeat was being hosted on the well-established BBC Two, that honour alone never guaranteed success. When checking available data, none of the Silurians' 7 episodes made the top 30 programmes for BBC Two in their week of broadcast, which suggests that they fell under the 2 million mark at some point. The repeat of the Silurians would conclude in January of 2000, and what was to follow in this line wasn't perhaps what the BBC originally had in mind. But as the Silurians helped Who fans see out 1999 and the 20th century as a whole, despite the dawn of a new millennium being a generally exciting time for many, it was quite the opposite for any Whovian. With no firm news from the BBC that the show would receive another reprieve, you could be forgiven for assuming that going forward, you'd have to rely on existing adventures from the original series, or new adventures in either print or audio. Not a bad future, by any means. After all, the legacy of Doctor Who was living on, but deep down, every fan secretly hoped that the show would return to TV in some way, at some point. The year is 2000. The new millennium had dawned. After realising that we weren't all going to be wiped out by the Millennium Bug, Doctor Who fans emerged once more with a thin hope that their beloved show would get another chance. Though as time went on, that hope wasn't fueled by any random rumour that circulated. They'd been burned before, and after 4 years since Paul McGann took the reins, it looked as if the TV movie may well and truly have been a sort of swan song for the famous Time Lord. However, early into the year 2000, the Doctor would return to BBC television, though not in the manner originally planned. When the recent run of repeats had started towards the end of 1999, the original plan had been to air every colour story chronologically, starting with Spearhead from Space and working all the way up until Survival, presumably. We saw how things began with Spearhead from Space and Doctor Who and the Silurians, but things took a sharp turn in the new year. The viewing figures for these first 2 repeats, well, they were lacklustre, to say the least. So in a panic, instead of screening the Ambassadors of Death, the BBC decided to jump right on ahead to the Tom Baker era, to Genesis of the Daleks in particular. You heard me right, Genesis of the Daleks, yet again. Like the Silurians, there is no available ratings data for this one, and again, none of the 6 episodes appear on the top 30 programmes list for BBC Two, implying that viewership stayed under 2 million, or perhaps sunk even lower, maybe even ending up below 1 million. The story was undeniably a popular one in the Doctor Who lineup, frequently cited as one of the best, but by 2000 it had already seen numerous repeats on BBC television, and had been widely available on VHS for almost a decade. Whatever the result, the viewing figures for Genesis had been so poor that the BBC decided to scrap any further planned Doctor Who repeats they had initially lined up. This great repeat season on BBC Two, aiming to get through every colour story, was now dead in the water after just 3 serials had gone out to air. Perhaps the public well and truly had finished with reminiscing and were turning on their televisions to watch something new. With the 21st century having finally arrived, despite big changes in the world, this wouldn't stop the near 20-year-old Doctor Who VHS line from trundling onwards. 6 different releases would come out in the year 2000, these being The Greatest Show in the Galaxy, The Invasion of Time, The Edge of Destruction, paired together with the show's pilot episode, Time Flight, a remastered version of An Unearthly Child, and a special Cybermen-themed tin, featuring Attack of the Cybermen and The 10th Planet, the missing final episode presented as a reconstruction. As more and more gaps began to be filled on fans' shelves, those who may be past the first time could be tempted by the new DVD format. The 5 Doctors may have been the first Doctor Who DVD to market in 1999, but the sole release from 2000 ushered in many of the common templates we would see throughout the new range. The design of the cover, the menu system, these would become hallmarks and staples of the DVD range for more than a decade. The Robots of Death, the story chosen to be released in November 2000, was only just the beginning, but more on that when we get there. Meanwhile, in the print world, the 8th Doctor continued his run of original adventures. Stories fans could enjoy during 2000 included Parallel 59, The Shadows of Avalon, The Fall of Yequatane, Cold Heart, The Space Age, The Banquo Legacy, The Ancestor Cell, The Burning, Casualties of War, The Turing Test, and Endgame. The Doctor's first 7 incarnations enjoyed their own adventures, with releases such as Last of the Gadarene, Tomb of the Valdemar, Verdigris, Grave Matter, Heart of TARDIS, Primetime, Imperial Moon, Festival of Death, Independence Day, and The King of Terror. But alongside the shelf space needed for these books, if fans wanted to consume all original adventures being made, they'd have to make some CD space. Big Finish Productions entered full swing with their monthly range, creating brand new audio adventures for the 5th, 6th, and 7th Doctors, with all 3 original actors returning to reprise their roles. The stories released in 2000 were The Land of the Dead, The Fearmonger, The Marian Conspiracy, The Genocide Machine, Red Dawn, The Spectre of Lanyon Moor, Winter for the Adept, The Apocalypse Element, The Fires of Vulcan, The Shadow of the Scourge, The Holy Terror, and The Mutant Phase. Many of these early adventures would go on to be regarded as true classics, a bright sign of the output that was to come in the audio drama world. So as 2000 drew to an end, there was a wider spark in the expanded universe of Doctor Who. With new adventures now being delivered via audio dramas as well as published books, fans had more choice than ever, and looked ahead to the new year to see just how that expanded universe would continue to grow. The year is 2001, and Doctor Who's profile, on television at least, continued to grow ever smaller. Aside from the occasional appearance as the butt of a joke or as part of a skit, or even in some adverts, there were no repeats on BBC television throughout the year. You can forgive them somewhat, given how far the viewing figures fell during the repeats from 1999 and 2000. After that showing, you'd expect the BBC not to go down that route again, at least for some time. The only outlet on the small screen was primarily via UK Gold, now entering its 9th full year of showcasing Doctor Who. The channel was consistent, broadcasting omnibus editions of all the colour stories, going out on weekend mornings. 2001 began with Invasion of the Dinosaurs on the 7th of January, and ran chronologically all the way until Paradise Towers, which saw out the year on the 30th of December. So even if the BBC wouldn't go to any graces in airing its back catalogue, at least viewers could rely on UK Gold to pick up the slack, or they could build a library of tales from the TARDIS themselves, even on a newer format. Despite DVD continuing to escalate in popularity, VHS was still very much a viable and popular format in 2001. Even though the well of past adventures was fast running dry, 7 releases still made it to market. These were a remastered version of the Daleks, Delta and the Bannermen, a re-release of City of Death, The Sunmakers, Four to Doomsday, a master theme set featuring Colony in Space and the Time Monster, but the biggest release of the year was perhaps the Davros collection. Even though the 5 stories in it were all re-releases, having all the Davros-centric adventures collated into one set would have been incredibly exciting for any Doctor Who fan in 2001. The collection was limited to just 10,000 copies, presented in quite the striking package. Even though it's been superseded by DVD or Blu-ray releases, some fans still hold on to this once iconic set. Speaking of DVDs, 2001 marked the first year in which more than one Doctor Who release would hit the format. 5 titles in total arrived on disc, these being Spearhead from Space, Remembrance of the Daleks, The Caves of Androzani, the TV movie, and Vengeance on Varos. These 5 releases seem quite bare bones in terms of their additional content by today's standards, and all 5 would ultimately see beefed up re-releases in the coming years. But it's a solid starting lineup, choosing popular or significant stories from a variety of Doctors, as well as the TV movie, at that time still the most recent main televised episode. Paul McGann, however, was still viewed by the majority as the incumbent Doctor, and the BBC Books range definitely reflected as such. The batch of new adventures to reach print in 2001 were Escape Velocity, Earthworld, Vanishing Point, Eater of Wasps, The Year of Intelligent Tigers, The Slow Empire, Dark Progeny, The City of the Dead, Grim Reality, and The Adventures of Henrietta Street. Doctors 1 to 7 got their share of new material, including titles such as The Quantum Archangel, Bunker Soldiers, Rags, The Shadow in the Glass, Asylum, Superior Beings, Byzantium, Bullet Time, The Science Fiction, Dying in the Sun, and Instruments of Darkness. In the world of audio drama, Big Finish's monthly range continued, now with Paul McGann joining as the 8th Doctor, the first time reprising his role since his TV debut back in 1996. Titles this year were Storm Warning, Sword of Orion, The Stones of Venice, Minuet in Hell, Lugaroo, Dust Breeding, Blood Tide, Project Twilight, The Eye of the Scorpion, Colditz, Primeval, and The One Doctor. The 4 McGann adventures from 2001 went down a treat, introducing the original character of Charlie Pollard, who would quickly become a fan favourite, played wonderfully by India Fisher. With 2001 marking Paul McGann's official return to the role of the 8th Doctor, fans were hopeful that over the next few years he would continue to produce more original adventures alongside a slew of original companions, just as his predecessors had done. But whilst matters were alive and well in the audio world, the year closed out with no official news of a return to television. Though that didn't mean cogs weren't slowly turning behind the scenes, but more on that when we get there. The year is 2002, and as Doctor Who approached its 40th anniversary, there were still no major signs of a revival for the programme. Its profile in the mainstream continued to diminish, becoming the subject of ridicule once again. No more was this emphasised than by Michael Grade's appearance on Room 101. The former BBC One controller lambasted the programme, much to the delight of the audience, and the public mood at the time largely reflected his words. Not to be put down, however, the franchise pushed on, and if the BBC wasn't going to make a big push for television, just as always, it would be other forms of media that would keep the flame of Doctor Who alive. UK Gold celebrated 10 years of repeating Doctor Who, not by actually doing any special events, but by doing what it always did: reach the end of the run with Survival, and then starting back at the beginning of the colour stories with Spearhead from Space. It was a tried and true formula, but at this point, a decade in, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. 2002 would mark the final year in which Doctor Who VHS releases would outnumber those seen on DVD. There weren't many titles left to issue on tape, and the format itself was gradually losing its market share to the DVD piece by piece. The 7 releases to reach VHS in 2002 were Planet of Giants, Underworld, The Ambassadors of Death, The Creature from the Pit, The Invisible Enemy, the Time Lord Collection, which contained re-releases of The War Games, The Three Doctors, and The Deadly Assassin, and finally, a special First Doctor box set, featuring the last 3 complete adventures featuring William Hartnell that hadn't yet been released to tape. These stories were The Sensorites, The Time Meddler, and The Gunfighters. But whereas one range was reaching its conclusion, another was continuing to blossom and grow. 5 new DVDs were released, these being The Tomb of the Cybermen, The Ark in Space, Carnival of Monsters, The Aztecs, and Resurrection of the Daleks. All 5 would receive expanded special editions many years later. It's fascinating to see Doctor Who healthily occupy 2 different formats, and it makes you wonder how long fans were willing to cling on to the older VHS for sake of completing their collections. Even though we don't have reliable sales data for every release, it would be curious to see how much VHS dwindled off as the 2000s progressed and the DVD began to take over. Books were still very much king, at least in terms of new original adventures for the Doctor in all of their incarnations. New stories for the 8th Doctor in 2002 included Mad Dogs and Englishmen, Hope, Anarchophobia, Trading Futures, The Book of the Still, The Crooked World, History 101, Camera Obscura, Time Zero, and The Infinity Race. For the Doctors before McGann, there was Relative Dementius, Drift, Palace of the Red Sun, A Morality Tale, Warmonger, 10 Little Aliens, Combat Rock, The Sons of Karesh, and Heritage. Complementing the books in terms of new adventures was of course Big Finish. Their monthly output for Doctors 5 to 8 in 2002 included Invaders from Mars, The Chimes of Midnight, Seasons of Fear, Embrace the Darkness, The Time of the Daleks, Neverland, Spare Parts, Ish, The Rapture, The Sandman, The Church and the Crown, and Bang Bang a Boom, which is essentially Doctor Who meets Eurovision and is like the most glorious thing ever. By this point, it was becoming clear that Big Finish, like the books before them, were willing to experiment and push the boundaries with Doctor Who, telling darker or more experimental stories, some of which when you listen to, you'd think of never have made it past the BBC bosses. 2002 had been another great year for original Doctor Who content, and fans were lapping up as much as they could. I'm sure some had given up the prospect of their favourite show returning to its rightful home on the small screen, but if 2002 had been yet another year of disappointment, then 2003 was going to be proven as one hell of a year for the Whoniverse. The year is 2003, and boy, this was the big one. Doctor Who's 40th anniversary. Granted, it had been off the air for 14 of those years, but it had always remained in some form alive. As we've discovered, whether it was via VHS, original new books or audios, the Doctor and his many friends and foes never truly faded away. This certainly was true of the UK Gold repeats, which continued on as ever throughout 2003, showing all the colour stories from 1970 until 1989. Over the 40th anniversary weekend itself, it hosted a Doctor Who at 40 event, dedicating most of its schedule to the programme. For the first time in many years, BBC Television would join in with the celebrations, but we'll touch on that in just a little bit. After 20 years, 2003 would finally mark the end of the Doctor Who VHS range. It was bound to happen eventually, with the newer DVD continuing to grow in popularity, stripping away VHS sales more and more with each passing year. The final 5 titles to be released on VHS were as follows: The Mutants, Meglos, The Horns of Nimon, Invasion of the Dinosaurs, which was the last complete adventure to be issued on tape, complete with a nice little dedication to the range in the sleeve notes. But the final release, full stop, would be this set, centred around the Reign of Terror, and containing the surviving episodes for the Faceless Ones and the Web of Fear. This set was released around the time of Doctor Who's 40th anniversary, fitting perhaps that a home video range that began during anniversary celebrations should finish during another round of them. But even though the Doctor Who VHS range was now complete, or as complete as it could have been for 2003, the DVD range still had plenty of room to grow and fill the shelves of fans and collectors all over again. This would also be the DVD range's biggest yet, with 8 titles released. These were The Seeds of Death, The Talons of Weng Chiang, The Dalek Invasion of Earth, Earthshock, The Two Doctors, The Curse of Fenric, a special Dalek Collector's release featuring Dalek adventures from the 1st, 5th and 7th Doctors, but the final DVD release of 2003 holds the most special place for me, as it's a release of The Three Doctors. This was the first ever classic Doctor Who DVD I ever owned, receiving it in late 2005, and as a new, eager young fan wishing to learn and watch all he could about the show's history, I couldn't have asked for a better introduction. So, all told, 2003 was a very significant year for Doctor Who on home media, the VHS range completing its run and bowing out after 20 years, and the DVD range experiencing its biggest year yet. The writing was well and truly on the wall that the digital versatile disc was here to stay, and Doctor Who had a long life ahead with it. Even though 2003 marked the 40th anniversary of Doctor Who, it didn't necessarily mean all departments were firing off on all cylinders. The BBC Books division is a prime example, whom instead of releasing one new 8th Doctor adventure a month, as they had done for several years, put out just 5 novels throughout 2003. These were The Domino Effect, Reckless Engineering, The Last Resort, Timeless, and Emotional Chemistry. The Past Adventures line suffered a similar fate, with just 6 releases. These being Fear of the Dark, Blue Box, Loving the Alien, The Colony of Lies, Wolfsbane, and Deadly Reunion. Even though the output of new books was slowing, Big Finish continued to release a brand new audio adventure every month of the year. 2003's releases were Jubilee, Necromantia, The Dark Flame, Doctor Who and the Pirates, Creatures of Beauty, Project Lazarus, Flip-Flop, Omega, Davros, Master, Zagreus, The Wormery, and Scherzo. This year's lineup has so many unique and fantastic adventures, Zagreus is a bonkers yet brilliant tribute to the programme's 40th anniversary, Scherzo kicks off a step into another universe, and played to perfection by Paul McGann and India Fisher, whereas Jubilee would go on to inspire a pretty significant story in just a few years' time. But more on that when we get there. During the summer, a rather interesting announcement was made by the BBC. Doctor Who would return, but not as a television series, not even as a live-action series. Instead, it would be returning as a Flash animated series, with Richard E. Grant to star as the Doctor, and for it to be produced by BBC I, the corporation's internet-based division. There had been original Doctor Who webcasts handled by BBC I before, such as Death Comes to Time from 2001, Real Time in 2002, and an updated version of the unbroadcast Shada in 2003, featuring the 8th Doctor instead of the 4th. But they contained a rather limited animation style, whereas this promised to take things to the next level. The premiere story, Scream of the Shalka, would be comprised of 6 15-minute long episodes, and debut on the Doctor Who website across November and December. Keep in mind, this was 2003, a time when many an internet user was still mostly relying on dial-up. It would take some time for these stories to buffer and load, even if they were made using Flash. But still, new Doctor Who was better than no Doctor Who, and this animated medium could open the door to some exciting possibilities down the line. Furthermore, fans took note that in much of the promotion for Shalka, Richard E. Grant was being specifically billed as the 9th Doctor, implying this animated form would continue the story from Paul McGann's 8th Doctor and fit into the overall continuity of the programme at large. People seemed to be on board with this, in principle, and I suppose after nearly a decade of silence from the BBC regarding Doctor Who's official continuation, why not continue the story with a new numbered incarnation? This would have all played out fine if it wasn't for an announcement that the BBC themselves would make just a few months later. On the 26th of September 2003, the news that fans had been waiting for almost 15 years was finally heard. The BBC announced that Doctor Who would be returning to TV as a fully fledged 13-episode series under the command and stewardship of one Russell T Davies, with filming due to begin the following year. To say this came out of nowhere is an understatement. Whilst Russell had been building his case to revive Doctor Who for some time, little of it had been publicised. So after years and years of absolutely nothing from the BBC, not even an inkling towards a new show, to have them suddenly announce its return mere months before its 40th anniversary seemed like a dream come true. But as exciting as this news was, an immediate flood of questions began to circulate amongst fans and the mainstream press alike. Who was going to be the new Doctor? Would McGann return to film a regeneration? Who would be the companion? What would the TARDIS look like? Would the Daleks return? How would the show be formatted? The list honestly could have gone on and on. Regardless of the speculation and theory, Doctor Who was officially and undeniably coming back to its rightful home on BBC One's Saturday night lineup. But before this new version of the show could arrive, there was a rather special birthday to celebrate first. November 2003, the 40th anniversary month itself. Doctor Who made an appearance on Children in Need that year, albeit in the form of a comedy sketch, featuring several past Doctors and monsters cropping up on a spoof version of the hit game show The Weakest Link. We've already talked about this segment in way more depth than probably is sane to, so feel free to go out and check it if you're interested. But of course, the main event that fans were looking forward to was the rolling out of the new animated adventure, Scream of the Shalka. The 6 episodes were published weekly on Thursdays between the 13th of November and the 18th of December 2003. The Flash animated format may look a bit gaudy more than 20 years on, but at the time it was lauded for being impressive given the technology and budget available to the production team. And remember, this was commissioned at a time when Doctor Who on TV seemed like a distant memory, so Shalka may well have been the only new visual adventure for quite some time. The story for me personally is alright. Don't get me wrong, I still enjoyed my time with it, but were these able to be regular 25-minute episodes, I think the story and characters could have been fleshed out a lot more. Richard E. Grant's take on the Doctor is an interesting one. I'd definitely be open to seeing more of him by story's end, and it's key to point out that this incarnation was billed officially as the 9th Doctor. Now, had the revival on TV not been announced, fans may have been content with this, but now, was the Shalka Doctor officially the 9th, or would the new TV Doctor be the 10th? Fans would once again have to play the waiting game before a true answer would be given. Although perceived by many as an oddity today, Scream of the Shalka is still worth giving a look in. If nothing else, it represented the route that Doctor Who could have embarked on had the television series not been revived by the BBC. If you'd like to check it out these days, it did receive a DVD release in 2013, which comes with a bunch of special features, so that's the route I'd recommend. It was novelised a few months after broadcast in early 2004, so if you'd like to check out the print version, you'll have to hit up the second-hand bookshops. As if 2003 couldn't have got any better for Doctor Who, a brand new hour-long documentary, in celebration of the programme, its 40th anniversary, and its recently announced return, was screened on BBC One on the 30th of December. The story of Doctor Who contained brand new interviews with several stars from across the show's history, explaining the brilliance and impact that Doctor Who has had since its launch in 1963. Many may have preferred 30 years in the TARDIS, but the story of Doctor Who is a perfectly serviceable documentary. And to be screened on BBC One, the flagship channel of the corporation, may truly be a sign that the BBC were taking Doctor Who seriously again. But we still had more than a year to wait before this new series would debut, so what was to come in the meantime? The year is 2004, and Doctor Who as a franchise was the most talked about it had been in nearly a decade. The announcement that a brand new series was in production fueled not just the fandom, but the mainstream press and even swaths of casual viewers also. Sure, there was still an amount of joking and ridicule going on, but many were excited at how a new series would look, sound and feel when viewing. But perhaps the question on most people's lips was, who would play the Doctor? Everyone would have to wait a couple of months into 2004 before they found out. But amidst all this excitement, how did the wide world of Doctor Who across different mediums fare? After 5 years of coexisting with the established VHS range, 2004 would mark the first year in which DVD was the sole format releasing past Doctor Who adventures to eager fans. Even though many had already owned the stories on tape, the extensive restorations, together with the increasing amount of special features included, made the upgrade seem like more than a worthwhile purchase to many. 6 stories were issued on disc during 2004, these being The Visitation, Pyramids of Mars, The Green Death, The Leisure Hive, Ghostlight, and the rather special release, Lost in Time. This would be something of an essential title when it came to orphan episodes. Across 3 discs, it contained 18 surviving episodes from a variety of partially missing stories from across the first and second Doctor's eras. Whilst today the set is mostly obsolete, either due to episode recoveries or animations, the importance and impact this set had cannot be understated. Just like 2003, only 5 new tales featuring the 8th Doctor were published by BBC Books. These were Sometime Never, Half-Life, The Tomorrow Windows, The Sleep of Reason, and The Deadstone Memorial. There were also 5 new stories for Doctors 1 to 7, these being Empire of Death, The 11th Tiger, Synthespians, The Algebra of Ice, and The Indestructible Man. With production of a brand new television series on the way, some fans began to speculate whether BBC Books were slowly winding down both ranges, with the hope that perhaps new books featuring the brand new Doctor would be coming down the pipeline as a replacement. They'd have to wait until the following year to truly find out that answer. Meanwhile at Big Finish, more monthly audio dramas came trundling onto CD. 2004's offerings being The Creed of the Crowman, The Natural History of Fear, The Twilight Kingdom, The Axis of Insanity, Arrangements for War, The Harvest, The Roof of the World, Medicinal Purposes, Faith Stealer, The Last, Keodroya, and The Next Life. Many of this year's releases continued the ongoing 8th Doctor storyline, and it's one I highly recommend if you haven't heard it before. But just like with the BBC Books, some wondered just how long Big Finish could continue making original adventures with past Doctors. After all, with the 9th Doctor debuting on TV screens soon, the BBC could decide to revoke the license from Big Finish, choosing to focusing on producing multimedia content solely based on the new series. Once again, fans and to some extent Big Finish themselves would have to wait another year before they would get their answer. Spring 2004 would herald many milestone moments in anticipation of the new series. First and foremost, it was announced that Christopher Eccleston would be taking control of the TARDIS, portraying what Russell definitively termed as the 9th Doctor. This statement finally dispelled confusion or discussion that Richard E. Grant's incarnation from Scream of the Shalka was the official 9th Doctor. This latter version would be assigned an alternative status. There had been rumours, long before Shalka even, that Grant was in contention for playing the Doctor on TV. Russell dispelled this outright in an interview, saying, "I thought he was terrible. I thought he took the money and ran, to be honest. He was never on our list to play the Doctor." With the 9th Doctor now firmly in place, production on the first new series of Doctor Who in 15 years began, with a transmission date due for the spring of 2005. There's a lot to say regarding the casting of the Doctor and their new companion, as well as several other aspects, but naturally, we'll be saving that for next time. Rather oddly, there was just one instance of Doctor Who being screened on one of the main BBC channels during 2004. This was episode 1 of The Web of Fear, at that time the only surviving episode of that story. It was screened in late June 2004 on BBC4, another of the Beeb's digital channels that had launched in 2002. The reason for its showing was as part of a series of classic 60s sci-fi and fantasy repeats originally made by the BBC. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any reliable or concrete ratings data for this repeat, but regardless, it's nice to see that the episode was included, representing Doctor Who as one of the top examples of 60s sci-fi the BBC had made. As interesting as this repeat is, it was definitely overshadowed by the overwhelming joy that brand new Doctor Who would be transmitted in just a year's time. When long-running shows enter a dark period with no new material produced on the small screen, it can be all too common that any interest in the franchise will ebb away and die out. But Doctor Who was built different. Having kept its flame alive in the first half of the 90s, with books, VHS releases and the ever-faithful Doctor Who magazine, the programme sustained an interest that carried up until the TV movie. When that sadly didn't turn into a full series, the stakes for Doctor Who were raised even higher. Many thought it had had its second chance, that to get a third was pretty much impossible. But the train continued on. More videos and then DVDs from the BBC, original new adventures from the Beeb and Big Finish on audio, all to keep the spirit and legacy of this silly little sci-fi show alive and well in the hearts and minds of the many it had connected with. There's numerous factors you can attribute to the show's eventual comeback, but arguably one of the most important ones is the fans. Without the fans' enthusiasm and dedication, buying the home media releases, reading the books, listening to the audios, etc., there's every chance that the BBC may have decided never to have taken a chance on Doctor Who again. So if you were one of those fans who endured the never-ending doubt of the wilderness years, first or second time around, then I salute you. Because without you, Doctor Who may not be the renewed cultural institution that it very much is today. So those are the ratings details for the second part of the Wilderness Years. I hope you enjoyed this numerical look back at Doctor Who's second prolonged dark period, a time when it really felt as if the show would never continue on TV. If you want to read more about Doctor Who and the making of it, then I highly recommend the Complete History series of books, which I used as reference for this video. Please consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, and leaving your thoughts of the Wilderness Years in the comments section below. I've been Adam Martyn from AMTV, and we'll see you next time for a whole new era of Doctor Who. Thank you to our patrons for helping to support the show, and a special thank you to Macra, Ben Freeman, Ethan Carberry-Holt, Bruce Danton, Globe of Reviews, Derek Chambers, Sean Knock, Dord Khan, Liam Domain, Trev Hughes, AJ Mac 200017, Harper, Deck KP20, and Simon Harrison, our AMTV staff members.